this is obviously the block where we get to bang on about stuff that we've talked about before. So I did go into this a bit in my opening session. I think this is something that's really important. So before I start, how many people are already working on or towards storing APL source in text files? It's not bad, it's about half. So maybe I don't need to do this. How many people are familiar with the load and save user commands? It's not quite the same amount of people, but it's getting close. This is encouraging. So I won't do this again next year, probably. How many people love GitHub? Oh, that's more than this morning. How many people loathe GitHub? Okay. And how many people would say, what's GitHub? Okay. So I did cover that so you weren't awake in the morning session then. All right. So a brief review of how we have handled APL source code historically. Obviously, they did use text very early on. This is a piece of parchment discovered somewhere in a drawer. So originally we just used a workspace, and I think many people still do that. It's very convenient. You have a workspace. It's got the variables in it. It's got the code in it. It's very, very convenient for a while. But as soon as you need to share it with other people, you need to version it, you need to version parts of it, it becomes very, very complicated. So I think anybody who built a serious APL application quickly moved on to using APL component files. And some people have written very elaborate source code management, very good ones built on component files, tightly integrated perhaps with their project management system or other pieces of process management in their companies. Some people took the next step and wrote the same kind of system but based on relational databases, Oracle, FlipDB. I know of at least 2 source code implementations, management implementations written in APL. But now I'm here to try and sell the half of you who didn't put your hands up on the idea of moving to Unicode text files. So there has been support in APL, in Dyalog APL for text files. In fact, nearly 20 years ago now, John Daintree did work on, because we wanted, or Dyadic Systems at the time wanted to support APL as an ASP.NET language. There was a mechanism for writing ASP.NET web pages containing APL code that was compiled into DLLs or workspaces. So there is in fact some history. I don't know how many people, I know there are some people here who are still using that. But really it was in version 12, I'm not sure it was 0 or 1, that Dan and I built the original salt with the load command. So you can use it, there's the user command. How many people are also using it under program control to dynamically load source code? Okay, so there are people who know about that. Then about, 2 years ago, we really felt it was time, the time was approaching where the APL interpreter should take over from Salt. And we took the first steps. The editor had direct support for external files, not just .dialog files with APL code, but we also support, what do we support, John? XML, JSON, there's some syntax highlighting. We recognize external source files that might also be useful to your application in addition to the APL source. The quad fix system function that can create a class or a namespace from a vector of vectors of text was extended to be able to read source from text files. So you don't actually need to do this anymore. You could be using quad fix directly. You can also, if you're on the Windows platform, if you have a folder full of .dialog files, I'll demonstrate that in a bit. If you double click on one, our default installation has set up a runtime system that will load the file up and edit it so you can get full APL syntax coloring. How many people are aware of that? That you can just double click on a dialog file? Yeah? That's very neat. And if you, I think it's also set up so if you receive an email with an attachment, which is a .dialog file, you can preview it in Outlook, and it'll use the same mechanism. It's a general mechanism in Windows to associate an editor or a viewer with any file extension. At the moment, we're in a slightly difficult position because Salt does things very slightly differently from QuadFix. We're hoping that in version 17, we'll put some code fixes into Salt and maybe enhance QuadFix a little bit so that Salt can start being based on QuadFix. We bring these things together and it really becomes industrial strength, fully integrated support. So at Dyalog, first it was just Morten and Dan playing with this thing, but gradually it grew. The whole tools group now is doing their work based on text files. Hopefully Andy is listening and will soon move all the QA scripts to source files so that we can have them in SVN along with the C code that they're making tests for, etc. I mean, that's a big part of the motivation is to, if you have a system that consists of bits of APL and bits of other stuff, you can bring them together in the same tool set. So the Dyalog file server, my server, VecDB, we're in SubVersion. Today, I think we have 25 projects at Dyalog. 25 public projects on GitHub that we're managing in this fashion. And in the last year, I have found out that some of the major users, sort of the top 5 users, about half of them at least now, are thinking of, in the very near term, moving to this kind of use of source code, using Git. You can install Git as an internal, GitHub as an internal enterprise system, and that seems to be on the way to becoming mainstream. So it's time for everybody to learn about it. All right, this means you. What are the benefits? Well, I think the one that's really driving it, as we've said a few times, is the integration with mainstream tools, SubVersion, GitHub, Mercurial, CVS, bunch of different file diff tools. I mean, any tool that anybody invented to view, look at source code, look at changes in source code, is immediately applicable to these files. You can easily share code between APL versions. So if you have a .dialog file, it can be loaded by version 12.0 if it doesn't contain syntax that isn't supported there. Whereas a workspace is not compatible. Component files and workspaces are not backwards compatible. If you use script files, you don't have that problem at all. The one that I won't put in writing, but some people find quite convenient, is that if you're using text files and every time you edit a function, it gets written back to the text file, then if you get the Sysera 999, you're still laughing. Nothing is lost. What's the Sysera 999? Yeah, well, I know there are some people, sorry, I didn't mean to mention that. Please disregard the last 30 seconds. But also really importantly, you can collaborate with people, you can show them APL code. Here I actually used Adam doesn't like the syntax, he's going to tell us what he decided is good a bit later. But you see, even up here where I've just used Calibri, the APL symbols are perfectly readable. So most operating systems today will display readable APL without installing APL fonts. It may not be pretty, but it's quite good. On Linux, I think it's actually very decent. And on Linux, thanks to Jeff, they even come with APL keyboard support built in. So you can configure a Linux and add APL as a keyboard. So this stuff is getting quite easy to use. Here's an example of using Notepad++, which is just an enhanced text editor, using Courier New. Under Windows, the APL is all perfectly readable. This is not readable at all near the back, but it's just to show there's a tool called Total Commander that I think Brian prefers as his diffing tool, diffing some APL. Beyond Compare, is that Michael's favorite? I showed a screenshot of this before. It's something called Source Tree, which is hooked up to GitHub and allows us to manage the GitHub projects, diffing them, managing branches, and so on. The APL, for those who are sitting close enough, is perfectly readable, even though I haven't selected APL 385. Of course, many of these editors, you could select APL 385 Unicode as the font, if you want to. Here's a slide from Dyalog 08 in Elsinore, migrating to Unicode presentation, where I showed something called Compare It. So this is I have been going on about this for a while. Hopefully I can soon stop. So in version 16, we decided that any new utility libraries that we developed and shipped, wherever that made sense, we would ship them in the form of text files. So if you look under Dyalog, your Dyalog installation, there's something called Library Core, in which you have a general purpose loading utility that allows you to load and initialize a bunch of tools, Conga, SQAPL, escapes me what the full list is, sharp plot. So you sort of have a general way of saying, please load one of Dyalog's tools, I intend to use it. There's APL process, which is for launching processes under APL program control. There's a library Conga, where we have some utilities for doing this, corresponds, I guess, to the curl library. Retrieving HTML stuff, there's an FTP client implementation. And then there's also a samples folder where there's really only stuff in the Conga. For Conga, there's a bunch of sort of sample servers, how to write a very, very simple HTTP server or a remote procedure call framework, how to generate certificates. So that's the first round of text sources shipped with Dyalog APL. Each one of these actually corresponds to a GitHub repository, but as I said in the intro, all of the ones that we think are really important to people will be shipped with the product in folders under the main Dyalog folder, in addition to being available on GitHub. Oops. That's my crib sheet. Time for a demo. This is what I'm supposed to remember to do. Where's my APL session? Okay, so is that big enough? Make it a bit bigger. Okay. So in Salt, I've prepared a very small folder with a couple of files in it. Is that? Yeah, that's, I think, fairly readable. All right, so if I want to load this file up here called plus twice in the APL SRC folder, I just type load. The important thing, of course, I think that many people would worry about is that a loss of control, right? So you're usually editing your function in the workspace, you understand it's in the workspace, you type save, the whole workspace is written back. But the way this is set up is that when you've loaded something using Salt or with 2-quad fix, I'll show in a minute, if you make a change, then the instant you exit the editor, you're given the choice of updating the text file. You can also disable this prompt so that it always does that. And you can see the file is immediately updated out here in the, we can see that the timestamp changed. So you don't get into a situation where you risk losing work by forgetting to save changes. On the contrary, it's better than the workspace from that perspective. So if we edit this function and call it, change its name, and change the definition to match, then it noticed that the function name had changed, so it didn't offer to update the file, and you need to explicitly say you want it to save another file. Now, in version 15, we added this functionality to the interpreter so that it can, for example, I can, without loading something into the workspace, I can edit the file directly by typing file : // I can read it into the workspace with this syntax here. We decided that we didn't want to be too clever about it and just guess if it said C:, because we might want to add later HTTP, Git, other prefixes so that you'd be able to fix code into the workspace directly from other types of sources. Again, if we edit the function, having loaded it using toQuadFix, we get a slightly different prompt because the interpreter offers you different options. Again, you have a save this response for all files so that you can decide you don't want to see the prompt if you know that you always want to do the same thing. So where we saw in the, I don't know if you noticed, I forgot to point it out, when we edited it in Salt, there was a comment line that had been added at the bottom with a cyclic redundancy check. The interpreter, of course, is maintaining that data for you in the workspace, so it doesn't need to add that comment. You don't see anything in the source code as you would with Salt. But there is an Ibeam, there are two Ibeams that allow you to query information so you can find out exactly what the interpreter has loaded and take decisions based on that if you're writing your own tools on top of this. One of the things that I hope JD's watching this, that the Salt will do is it allows you to use wildcards and so on. And we have two choices. Either we upgrade QuadFix to do something like that, or we decide that, well, we'll continue to have tools like Salt as a thin layer on top of it that will loop around and do the quad fixing under the covers. And now I'm going to show you sort of a day in my life. I did some work on Conga. Just before the workshop, I was doing some testing and I found out that some new code that we had written didn't support certificates. So you can see I made a few changes I added a few lines of code to deal with certificates. I'm clicking here on v3 client.dialog, and I can track that from inside source tree. If I open that folder up, we can see we have a bunch of folders here. I decided to, because we were making a bunch of structural changes to Conga from the APL code that supports Conga from version 2 to version 3, which was shipped with version 16, I felt that it was necessary to move the Conga project into text file format rather than try and manage that using workspaces. And what I then discovered was, after I'd created this structure, I sort of needed to take the workspace apart, and I wanted to keep the old form, which is quite different, around. So I have a v2 folder, I have a v3 folder with various classes inside it, various bits of source code. And I then discovered that the next thing I needed to do is prototype something that I've also been talking about for a very long time, which is a build mechanism for APL. Because I now needed to recreate the workspace from that that hierarchy of folders. So in an afternoon, as these things usually happen, and then somebody like Dan comes and makes it a real bit of software, or maybe in this case it'll be Adam, I dreamt up this syntax. So this is something that is very much a prototype. And I would very much like those of you who deal with build systems on a daily basis to discuss with us and talk about. This is not something that we're suggesting is how it's necessarily going to be. It's just we needed this internally, and we decided it was so useful, certainly for testing within the Dyalog organization, that we shipped it with the product, because otherwise it got too difficult to... So it's in there as an experimental user command that can build based on this. I'll run it for you. So basically what you can do is a build file has an ID and a description. It has defaults. That means anytime it creates a namespace, it's going to set these defaults inside it as it builds it. These are the defaults for any created namespace. There's a target workspace. This isn't actually currently used. That's just an idea I have that Dan, I know, and myself to some extent are inspired still by our memories of a system at IP Sharp Associates called Logos, which had this kind of mechanism built into it. We don't have a manual. Bob, do you have a manual that we could borrow? That might be useful. So the idea is that you'll have a build script and it'll have a target artifact, as I have just learned, they call it, the thing that you're building. And then there's something you can execute before you start. And then there's namespace and class keywords. And there's a sort of a wildcard that Salt can use to load it. And then there's a target namespace that it goes into. So this says take everything in v2 drc / any dialog file, make a namespace called drc and put it in there. Build HTTP utils, build samples, build Conga, and then if you know that something is a class, you declare that. And then we just got quad CSV, and I decided that it would be nice to use a CSV file for all the Conga error messages. So there's a CSV thing that will read a CSV file and put it into a variable. Yep, and then it sets the latent expression. So, I mean, all these things need to be in whatever we do, but if there are people who have ideas for better syntax, some other languages build system that we should get inspiration from, please let us know. We're willing to change this completely in the next release. It's only a user command anyway, so you know, you could have different versions of it. So if I want to use that, if I'm in a clear workspace, I just say DBuild, and it looks, by default, it looks in the folder, and if it finds a .dialog build file with the same name as the folder, it just runs that. Otherwise, I could have put the name of a build file. And it just steps through that thing line by line and does what you expect. So now I have, I have a working Conga workspace. I haven't saved it. I see I have the SaltVar data, which is Salt's tracking mechanism for variables that it's loaded. So it's tracking the error table that I loaded. I don't want that. And there's a production switch which says don't leave any any Salt tracking information in the workspace. Build a production workspace. And then, of course, once you've built your system, you need to test it. So there's also the beautifully named dtest user command. And again, there's a very simple, there's a very simple language for that. It's got an ID and a description, and then it's got a setup, and there are 3 functions named here, and that means what it's going to do is it's going to run each, it's an outer product, it runs each one of these in turn, and then it runs the entire test. And that's because we needed to create a workspace that would run in the version 2 compatible mode, in the version 3 mode, and in a explicitly created root object mode. And then there's a teardown function, and then there's just the tests you want to run. And that can be a list as long as you like. So it's very simple, but it has meant that we can now safely make changes to Conga and run all of Björn's unit tests, although it drove him mad to begin with because all of his old stuff stopped working in the new framework. And so that all the tests passed. There's a verbose mode, so you can see the individual steps. And in fact, it has a whole bunch of switches to do things like run it in quiet mode so that it can be run inside the dialog build system without messing up the output that's collected. Repeat the test some number of times. Override the setup and teardown functions. That I don't think is used. And then if you're a developer who's debugging it, you can have switches that tell it to set a stop on line of each function and stuff like that. Or to halt if when it hits an error, rather than collecting and logging the information and telling you that a test failed, it should halt so that you're a developer, you want to have a look at it. So at that point, having run the test, I should go back to source tree, stage the file, and click the commit button. But I'm not going to do that, both because I'm out of time and because I haven't discussed it with my colleagues, the changes that I have made. Okay, so we need to sort out those differences I alluded to between Salt and 2-quad fix. There's a specific problem in that Salt had support for having some syntax in a file which said this file requires other files, and that was done using some special comments. And the syntax for that needs to be different in the APL system. There's going to be a new :require keyword. There is a new :require keyword. And then, of course, the APL system wants the file : / on, whereas Salt didn't feel that it needed that. So we have a little bit of internal work to do, but I think we'll sort that out for 17. We need your help to sort these out. We need to add an actual package manager and define conventions for integrating of libraries, looking at what, I guess, Python and other similar languages do. And then we need to work on tools that will load and save very quickly very large bodies of code from a workspace out to files and back again. Adam's going to talk much more about this. This is something which is an integrated requirement. Jay talked about localization on lines other than 0. And what you need to do is get used to the idea, if you are not already used to it. This is the future. Talk to your IT people about the source code management systems that they're using and whether you should integrate your APL system with it. I had a conversation with one guy who worked in an insurance company who said, we use, I don't remember what it was, but the IT department says, I can't have a copy because I'm not a member of the IT department. So I can't install it. So it may take you some time to get through with this. Try to get comfortable with GitHub if you can. Look at our projects there, comment on them, and help us design those user commands. Or write your own. There's no way you could have your own. And ask me questions now, Ray.
Hello. Trying to get comfortable with GitHub.
Yep.
Will you do a workspace? Not workspace. A tutorial or a webinar on how to use GitHub and possibly source tree for APLers?
Yes.
Thank you.
We will. I don't know who. Might be me.
There's one thing. When you have functions and namespaces in one file, sometimes when you're testing, it's inconvenient if you've fixed a function. And is there going to be like a store function or something similar, so you can put one function back into the file? Because if you're working through something, you're testing, you debug something, you don't want to store the whole thing again there. It'd be quite useful if you could just put that one function back on file, which if you're doing text files, you probably could do that more easily in the workspace.
Well, I mean, the source code management system takes care of that, right? So you just update the whole file in your file system. When you do a commit, it only writes back small pieces.
No. When you're debugging and you're running your application, you have a bug.
Yeah.
You fix that function.
Yeah.
When do you file away a new copy of that function? I mean,
typically when you hit escape in the editor or the tracer.
Of that just one function, not.
Well, it depends on whether the function was loaded on its own from a file, or you loaded the whole namespace as a single file.
You'd have to save the whole namespace then.
Well, if the namespace was loaded from a single file, then there is only one file. If the namespace was constructed as it was, I mean, in this example here, if I go into, let's say Conga. No, I don't have any functions in there, do I? I go into here. I think there's a bunch of functions. If I change one of those, no, it was a production build. It threw away all the tracking. It would only update that one function. Yeah. But these are the kind of things where we need you to use the current mechanisms and say, this is not good enough.
Because I actually write mine, so I store mine as individual functions, so I can put them back each time. So I've resisted adopting.
Yeah, no, you should be
this,
able to do that now.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then okay, we have coffee for half an hour, so we're back here at 2:30. Thank you, Morten.
Thank you.